When Kevin, a young black kid, is on his way home, he comes upon a wallet that he had misplaced and gives it back to its owner, an elderly and affluent man called Mr. Whitley. The next day, a police officer shows up at Mr. Whitley's door. Before we go into the tale, we should consider what the possible explanation may be for this unexpected visit. Comment below where in the world you are watching from today. And if you enjoy this story, don't forget to subscribe to Kevin Johnson. As he stepped out of the school building, the warm afternoon sun kissed his freckled face, and he took a deep breath. Kevin Johnson, a black boy of 13 years old, hitched his backpack higher on his shoulders. Kevin's thoughts strayed to the forthcoming school trip as he strolled down the sidewalk towards his after-school work at the local newspaper firm. He took a deep breath and savored the fresh air as he started out down the sidewalk. His day was not yet finished, but he was determined to get there. Was an opportunity to travel to the state capitol and see all of the significant buildings that were located there. His eyes lit up with excitement at the thought, but then he remembered the cost. It was difficult for his mother to come up with extra money, which was the reason why he had taken this job in the first place. Kevin muttered to himself, "I can do this." Kevin's heart swelled with satisfaction as he pushed open the big glass door of the newspaper office. The newspaper office was a small brick structure with huge windows. Kevin picked up his pace and said, "Just a little bit more saving, and I'll have enough for the trip." He was met by the familiar scent of ink and paper, as well as the bustling buzz of phones ringing and people speaking. "Hey there, Kevin," the receptionist said. "Mrs. Thompson," with a kind smile. "As always, Kevin grinned back at you, Mrs. Thompson," he said. She gave him a stack of papers, which was nothing out of the ordinary, but Mr. Davis stated that he could have an additional work for you later. Kevin proceeded to the back room to sort his papers as he was being asked by Thompson if he had anything unusual for me today. Work. He couldn't help but feel grateful for this opportunity. It wasn't always easy to juggle school and work, but he knew it was worth it. His mother worked so hard to keep a roof over their heads and food on the table. This was the least he could do to help out and chase his own dreams as well. With his bag full of newspapers, his mom worked so hard to provide for them. Kevin began his delivery route by going from home to house, placing each paper according to the preferences of the clients. Some of the papers were put on the porch, while others were placed near the mailbox. Kevin took great delight in doing his job perfectly, regardless of how little the work may have been. When Kevin made his final delivery, it seemed as if the sun was beginning to sink lower in the sky. His arms were aching a bit, but his heart felt light. Another day's labor was done, and he was one step closer to achieving his objective. With a contented sigh, he headed back towards the direction he had come. The newspaper office, ready to see what additional assignment Mr. Davis might have for him. As Kevin finished his shift at the newspaper company, the sky had turned a soft orange color. He said his goodbyes to Mrs. Thompson and stepped out into the cool evening air. His backpack felt heavier now that it was filled with the weight of his schoolwork. Kevin's mind strayed to thoughts of supper and the homework that was waiting for him. But as he turned a corner, something grabbed his sight. There, lying on the gray pavement, was a brown leather wallet. Along with the books and the events of the day, the walk home seemed familiar. Each crack in the sidewalk was like an old acquaintance. Kevin stopped in his tracks and looked about, but the street was empty. He bent down and picked up the wallet, which felt heavy in his hands. He yelled out, "Hello," hoping that the owner may be around, but the only thing that replied him was the rustling of leaves. Kevin opened the wallet with delicate fingers. Kevin's eyes widened as he saw several crisp bills inside. There was also a driver's license and a few credit cards. For a brief moment, a small voice in his head whispered enticingly that money could go a long way towards his school trip fund. It would make things so much easier. However, as soon as the thought occurred to him, he pushed it away because he knew in his heart that it was not the right thing to do. Kevin whispered to himself, feeling a touch of remorse, and taking a long breath, Kevin made his choice that he would locate the wallet's owner. Someone out there was undoubtedly worried sick about losing their wallet. What would Mom say if she knew I even considered about keeping it? Kevin made his decision. Rightful owner, it was the right thing to do, even if it meant that his own dreams might have to wait a little longer. Kevin carefully tucked the wallet into his backpack, believing that he would figure out a way to return it safely when he got home. Kevin felt a renewed sense of purpose as he continued his walk. Kevin felt a warmth in his chest as he carefully studied the contents of the wallet. His brow wrinkled in concentration as he looked through the crisp cash and credit cards. He discovered a driver's license with his name printed on it. It wasn't always simple to do the right thing, but it definitely felt good. Grabbed his sight. Mr. Whitley. Mr. Whitley, Kevin murmured to himself. Understanding dawning on his face, he had heard that name before, whispered in hushed tones throughout the neighborhood. Mr. Whitley was known as the wealthy old man who lived in the enormous mansion on Oak. As Kevin stood there, the weight of the wallet in his hands felt heavier than it had before. He knew that returning it was the right thing to do, but the thought of actually going back to him was overwhelming. Street Kevin had never seen the reclusive gentleman, but stories about him circulated among the locals. Some people said he was grumpy and unfriendly, while others claimed he was just lonely. Kevin's stomach flutters with trepidation as he approaches the mysterious Mr. Whitley. What if he is mean? Kevin wonders out loud, his voice barely audible. Then he shakes his head, recalling the words of his mother, which are that you can't judge a book by its cover. Kevin made up his mind that he would return the wallet in person. It wasn't just about doing the right thing anymore. It was about taking responsibility and confronting his concerns with determination in his steps. So Kevin took a deep breath and made his decision. Instead of heading home, Kevin changed his course and turned towards Oak Street, where Mr. Whitley's house was located. As he walked, Kevin rehearsed what he would say in his head in an effort to calm his nerves. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows as Kevin approached the imposing house, which was larger than he had imagined it to be, and was neatly decorated. Trimmed hedges and a well-manicured lawn, the location made Kevin feel insignificant and out of place in his worn sneakers and school backpack, but he did not back down. Kevin knew that returning the wallet was important not only for Mr. Whitley, but also for himself. It was an opportunity to do something positive and make a difference, even if it was just for a moment. With each step that he took up the long driveway, Kevin's determination became stronger. He clenched his wallet securely, ready to face whatever was waiting for him outside Mr. Whitley's door. Kevin halted at the foot of the big estate, his eyes wide with wonder. The home was enormous, and it had aged to a great extent. Brick walls and ivy creeping up its sides were impressive, but there was an air of neglect about the place. Overgrown bushes flanked the entrance and paint was peeling off the window frames. Kevin took a deep breath as he climbed the worn stone steps to the front door. His heart was pounding in his chest as he raised his hand to the front door. Kevin's gut was churning with nervousness, but he forced the worry aside and wrapped his hand firmly on the door quiet. He waited for a while before knocking on the door, his knuckles inches from the hefty wooden door. What if he yelled at me? Kevin wondered. He followed Kevin as he shifted from foot to foot, wondering if he should knock again. Just as he was about to turn and leave, he heard shuffling footsteps from inside the door, and it creaked open, revealing Mr. Whitley. Mr. Whitley was tall, with wispy white hair and piercing blue eyes that seemed to look right through Kevin, the old man. The man's expression was guarded, and his bushy eyebrows were furrowed in suspicion. Yes. Mr. Whitley's voice was gruff, matching his stern appearance. Kevin swallowed hard, and his mouth suddenly became dry. "Hello, Mr. Whitley," he stammered. "I found your wallet on the sidewalk, and I wanted to return it to you." He held out the wallet with a trembling hand. Whitley's eyes darted from Kevin's face to the wallet and back again. Slowly he reached out and took it, his weathered fingers brushing against Kevin's palm. Mr. Whitley opened the wallet quickly, checking its contents. His expression softened slightly, though suspicion still lingered in his eyes. He looked back at Kevin, examining the boy's near, scared but earnest face after what seemed like a lifetime to Kevin. Mr. Whitley gave a curt nod. "Thank you," he said, his voice still gruff but with a touch of tenderness that was honest of you, as Kevin turned away from. Kevin felt a rush of relief sweep over him as he walked down the broken sidewalk. His pulse was still pounding, but it was now accompanied by a warm sense of contentment. He had done the right thing, despite the fact that it had been difficult for him to walk down the cracked pavement. Replayed the encounter in his mind. Mr. Whitley's gruff demeanor and piercing gaze had been intimidating, but there was something else there too. A flicker of surprise, maybe even appreciation. Kevin smiled to himself, realizing that his small act of kindness might have made a difference in the old man's day. The sun was setting as Kevin made. While he was making his way home, casting long shadows over the quiet streets of the neighborhood, he reflected on how tempting it had been to retain the wallet in order to utilize the money for his school trip. However, the feeling that he felt now was worth so much more than any amount of money. Perhaps Kevin believed that if others saw him, they would be more likely to give him money. His steps became a little lighter as he rounded the corner onto his street. Kevin could see the warm glow of lights from his modest home. He quickened his pace, eager to share his experience with his mother. Mrs. Johnson had told him that if other people were doing the right thing, they would be inspired to do it as well. The idea made him stand a little taller. She has always taught him about honesty and integrity, and she does it often by her own deeds, rather than simply words. She makes sure that Kevin becomes a kind and honest man like his father, who has already died away due to sickness. Kevin jumped up the front steps, pulled open the door, and yelled out to his mother, "You are not going to believe what took place today." Mrs. Johnson emerged from the kitchen, drying her hands on a dish towel. Her exhausted face lit up with joy when she saw the eager smile on her son's face. "What is it, sweetie?" she said, her voice filled with love. Kevin. He knew that she would be proud of him, and that meant more to him than anything else in the world. Kevin burst into the small, cozy living room, his eyes shining with excitement. Mrs. Johnson looked up from the worn couch where she was sitting, folding her hands. He couldn't wait to tell her about finding Mr. Whitley's wallet and returning it. Kevin shouted, "Mom, you won't believe what happened today," as he plopped down next to his mother. Mrs. Johnson put the shirt she was folding aside and gave Kevin her undivided attention. "What is it, sweetie?" she asked. Her expression softened as she saw her son's joy with the laundry. It was a warm and encouraging voice, and Kevin took a deep breath before beginning his story. He told her about the time he discovered Mr. Whitley's wallet on the sidewalk, the temptation he felt to keep the money for his school trip, and his decision to return it to its rightful owner. Mrs. Johnson's eyes became misty with emotion as Kevin continued to speak. She reached out and gently gripped his hand, saying, "Oh, Kevin, my son." She repeated it in a quiet voice. "I am so proud of you." Kevin felt a lump rise in his throat at his mother's words, and he inquired with his voice just above a whisper, "She validated that you made the right decision even when it was difficult, which requires genuine guts and integrity." Kevin buried his face in his mother's shoulder, feeling secure and loved. Mrs. Johnson nodded and pulled her into a close embrace. "You made the right choice." The moment they separated, Mrs. Johnson took his face in her hands and looked at him with eyes that were serious but compassionate. She said, "You know, honey, it's not always easy to do the right thing, especially when we're struggling ourselves, but honesty and kindness are worth more than any amount of money." Money. Kevin nodded, recognizing the significance of her words. He reflected on how diligently his mother worked to make ends meet, how she never complained even when times were difficult, and how her example had taught him more than any lecture could ever teach him. "I know, Mom," he replied. "I just kept going. I was thinking about what you would do, and I realized that I couldn't keep the wallet no matter how much I wanted to." Mrs. Johnson's eyes began to fill up with tears, and she held Kevin closer to her. At that very moment, the link that existed between the mother and her son seemed to become even deeper. Kevin awoke early the following morning, his mind still buzzing from the events of the previous day. He quickly got dressed, wolfed down a bowl of cereal, and gave his mother a quick hug before heading out the door. As he walked to school, the morning air was crisp and nipped at his ears. Kevin's foundation was built on love, trust, and shared values. Kevin's thoughts went back to Mr. Whitley and the wallet, and he wondered what the elderly man was doing at this moment. He wondered whether the old man had even realized that the wallet was gone before Kevin returned it. A little part of Kevin hoped that Mr. Whitley would probably reach out to him again, possibly to express his gratitude. However, Kevin was unable to think of anything else. Kevin found himself distracted a few times, his mind wandering back to the grand but lonely house where Mr. Whitley lived. He imagined what it must be like to live there. He shook his head and pushed the thought away, telling himself that he had done the right thing. That was enough. The school day passed in a blur of classes and conversations with friends. Kevin was rushing to his part-time work at the newspaper firm when the final bell sounded. As he sifted through piles of papers and prepared delivery, he couldn't help but wonder whether Mr. Whitley read the local daily. Perhaps he would see Kevin's name someday bringing good news. Kevin lived in such a large house all by himself, news rather than simply returning items that were lost. But Kevin did not allow these thoughts to divert his attention away from his work. Instead, he focused on each task with the intention of performing to the best of his abilities. After all, this job was important because it was assisting him in saving money for the school trip and contributing to the expenses of his family. Kevin took pride in his work. Kevin came to the realization that while the experience with Mr. Whitley had been thrilling, it was only one moment in his busy life. He had duties to concentrate on, such as school, his job, and assisting his mother. As he worked, he meticulously organized the documents and made sure that each delivery was accurate. That afternoon, as Kevin was finishing his shift at the newspaper company, there was an unexpected knock on the door of his home. Mrs. Johnson, who had just returned from her own job, answered it. Her heart skipped a beat when she saw a police officer standing there. The wallet incident had been an opportunity to do the right thing, but now it was time to move on. Today, it was time to move forward. "Afternoon, ma'am?" the officer inquired in a pleasant manner. "Is this the Johnson residence?" Mrs. Johnson nodded, her mouth instantly dry, and she answered, "Yes, it is." The officer then added, "I am here about a matter concerning your son Kevin. Is he okay?" When they heard the sound of footsteps coming, Mrs. Johnson's concern intensified. "He is still at work, but he should be home soon. What is this about? Is Kevin in trouble?" Just then, they heard the sound of footsteps approaching Kevin. Kevin turned the corner with his rucksack slung over one shoulder. Mrs. Johnson reached out to her son and pulled him closer as he approached these officers. "They say they need to talk to you." "Honey?" Kevin's mind raced had something to do with it. He stopped short when he saw the police officer standing in the doorway. Kevin's mother called out in a voice that was tinged with concern what was going on. He felt a knot building in his gut as he glanced up at the police. "Kevin Johnson?" the shorter officer asked, and when Kevin agreed, the officer added, "We need to ask you a question." This was regarding Mr. Whitley's wallet, which had occurred at the newspaper firm. Kevin and Mrs. Johnson exchanged troubled looks as the atmosphere in their little house suddenly seemed uncomfortable and heavy. Kevin's pulse hammered in his chest as he pondered what might have brought the police to their door. Kevin and Mrs. Johnson had a few concerns concerning an event that happened the day before. The police officer introduced himself as Officer Rivera, and then he stepped aside, revealing a familiar figure standing behind him. It was Mr. Whitley, who appeared slightly uneasy, but determined. Mr. Whitley said hello to Kevin, his voice being softer than Kevin remembered from their brief encounter the day before. "I hope you don't mind me dropping that." Kevin and Mrs. Johnson exchanged astonished looks, but Mr. Whitley did not seem to be shocked at all. Kevin responded in a voice that was a mixture of perplexity and curiosity. Mr. Whitley cleared his throat and stated that he wanted to contact you in order to properly thank you for returning my wallet. "I realized that I did not know where you lived, and these kind officers offered to assist me in locating you." Officer Rivera nodded. "Mr. Whitley came to the station asking for assistance, and we were happy to assist him given the circumstances. Mrs. Johnson, who had been listening intently, placed a reassuring hand on Kevin's shoulder, which was very comforting. "Considerate of you, Mr. Whitley," she said with a warm smile. Mr. Whitley's eyes wrinkled at the corners as he smiled at Kevin. "What you did yesterday meant more to me than you could possibly know. That wallet contained not only money but also precious memories of my late wife. Your honesty in returning it was truly appreciated." My heart was greatly moved by Mr. Whitley's remarks. Kevin felt a warmth grow through his chest. At Mr. Whitley's words, he hadn't realized just how significant the wallet was. "I've lived in this neighborhood for years," Mr. Whitley said, his voice thick with emotion, "but I've kept to myself. I thought to myself, your act of kindness reminded me of the goodness that exists in people, especially in our youth." Mrs. Johnson gave Kevin a gentle hug on the shoulder, her eyes shining with satisfaction. Kevin felt a lump develop in his throat, overwhelmed by the effect of his simple deed. "I simply did what anybody would do," Kevin said in a humble manner, but Mr. Whitley shook his head and said, "No, my boy. What you did was exceptional. It's not often that you come across someone with such integrity in this day and age. I wanted to thank you personally." Mr. Whitley took a deep breath, his eyes glistening with a newfound sense of purpose. "Kevin, your actions have touched people. I have been thinking about how I may demonstrate my thanks, and I believe I have discovered a method to do so." Kevin and Mrs. Johnson listened closely, and their interest was piqued. "I would want to create a complete scholarship. They have reminded me of the significance of connection and compassion. Fund for you, Kevin," Mr. Whitley declared in a voice filled with affection, "that this fund would cover your education all the way through college." The words lingered in the air for a while, as Kevin and Mrs. Johnson attempted to digest what they had just heard Kevin's declaration. Mr. Whitley's eyes widened in surprise, and Mrs. Johnson's hand shot to her mouth in shock. Mrs. Johnson's voice was thick with emotion as she stutteringly said, "That is incredibly generous, and we don't know what to say." Kevin stood there astonished, unable to comprehend what he had just heard. As the realization of Mr. Whitley's offer dawned on him, tears began to fill up in his eyes. "I don't know how to thank you," Kevin managed to utter, his voice hardly rising above a whisper. Mr. Whitley smiled. "I never imagined that returning a wallet could lead to something so life-changing. Kindly, you. You already have my boy. Your honesty and integrity have given me a renewed faith in humanity. This is my way of ensuring that your bright future is not hindered by financial constraints." Mrs. Johnson, overcome with emotion, stepped forward and took Mr. Whitley's hands in hers. "Mr. Whitley, you have no idea what you are doing. I have no clue what this means to us. Kevin has always dreamt of going to college, but we have been concerned about how to fund it. It's a miracle." Kevin nodded while wiping away tears. "Thank you, Mr. Whitley. I promise I'll make the most of this chance. I won't let you down in the days after graduation from Masters." It was Whitley's generous offer that caused Kevin's life to begin to change in ways that he had never anticipated. The news of the scholarship quickly spread throughout their small town, and all of a sudden, Kevin found himself at the center of attention at school. His teachers pulled him aside to offer their congratulations, and Mrs. Peterson, his English teacher, was the one who congratulated him. Kevin, who was still numb to all the praise, flushed as she talked to him after class. "I am so proud of you," she said, her eyes beaming. "Your honesty has truly paid off. You've set a wonderful example for your classmates." Kevin, who was still unused to all the praise, thanked Mrs. Peterson. "I was just doing what I believed was right in the corridors," and his peers congratulated him, clapped him on the back, and gave words of appreciation. Some of them even asked for his signature, much to Kevin's chagrin. "Way to go, Kevin," his buddy Tom shouted after lunch, "that you're like a superhero." Kevin, a local celebrity now, remained grounded despite the newfound attention he received. He continued to concentrate on his studies, determined to make the most of Mr. Whitley's generous gift. After school, he continued to go to his part-time job at the newspaper company, refusing to let his responsibilities at the newspaper slip away. Kevin, my child, you've made us all proud. It's not every day that we have a local hero working for us. Kevin lowered his head humbly and said, I'm no hero, Mr. Johnson. I just want to keep doing my best both here and at the office. His employer, Mr. Johnson, welcomed him with a warm grin. As Kevin went about his duties at school, delivering papers and assisting with office work, he couldn't help but feel thankful for the opportunity that Mr. Whitley had provided for him. He was determined to demonstrate that he was deserving of the scholarship, not just for Mr. Whitley's sake, but also for his own future and the future of his mother. Sacrifices. As the weeks went by, Kevin found that he was increasingly drawn to Mr. Whitley's grand old house. At first, his visits were sporadic, but they quickly became a regular part of his routine. Every Tuesday and Thursday, after his shift at the newspaper company, Kevin would make his way up the winding path to Mr. Whitley's front door. Kevin would cry out with a happy tone as he knocked on the door. Good afternoon, Mr. Whitley. Is there anything I can assist you with today? Mr. Whitley, who had been so reclusive in the past, started to look forward to these visits, and he would meet Kevin with a warm greeting. He smiled, his eyes wrinkled at the corners, and said, Come on in, son, there's always something to be done around here. Together they undertook little jobs about the home. Kevin mowed the lawn, helping to control the overgrown grass that had started to take over the formerly manicured yard. He cleaned out the gutters and swept the floor. As they worked side by side, Mr. Whitley started to open up to Kevin. He related anecdotes from his younger days, including tales of adventure and hard labor, which had Kevin hanging on every word. Kevin in turn chatted about his own life. He even helped Mr. Whitley sort old pictures that had been gathering dust in the attic. Kevin, you have a good head on your shoulders and a nice heart to match, and Mr. Whitley would say that you would go far in life. Mark my words, these words of encouragement meant a lot to you. Aspirations for the future, his ambitions of being a journalist one day. You have a good head on your shoulders. The world to Kevin, he found himself looking forward to their time together just as much as Mr. Whitley did. The old man's house, which had been a symbol of isolation in the past, was now filled with the sounds of laughter and friendly conversation as the bond between them grew. Kevin realized that he had gained more than just a scholarship in Mr. Whitley. Kevin's presence offered Mr. Whitley a revitalized sense of purpose and excitement to his twilight years. On a bright day, as Kevin assisted Mr. Whitley in sorting through old boxes, Mr. Whitley realized that he had discovered a mentor, a friend, and maybe even the grandpa figure that he had never had. Kevin, my kid, Mr. Whitley murmured quietly. Come here. I want to show you something. Kevin put down the dusty book he had been carrying and came over to Mr. Whitley's office. The elderly man stood in the attic, clutching a fading picture in his trembling hands. This caused his eyes to glaze up as he glanced at the image. That's my Elizabeth, Mr. Whitley said, his voice thick with emotion, as the image showed a much younger Mr. Whitley standing arm in arm with a stunning lady. Both of them were smiling broadly, and their eyes sparkled with delight. Mr. Whitley added that we had been married for 47 lovely years. Before she died away, Kevin listened attentively as Mr. Whitley started to tell tales about his life with Elizabeth. He spoke about their first date, their wedding day, and the adventures they'd enjoyed together. As he spoke, the loneliness that had been engraved on his face appeared to slip away, and it was replaced with a sad expression. I have 5 grandkids now, but I don't get to see them very often. Kevin's heart aches as he watches them. Grin. We had 2 children. Mr. Whitley proceeded, bringing out another picture. This one showed a family gathering around a Christmas tree. Both of them have relocated abroad with their families. I'm sorry, Mr. Whitley, Kevin whispered quietly as he placed a reassuring hand on the shoulder of Mr. Whitley. I understood how lonely Mr. Whitley must have been all these years. The large mansion, which had once been filled with laughter and joy, had become a melancholy reminder of what he had lost. old man's shoulder, Mr. Whitley looked up at Kevin, his eyes shining with tears that had not yet been shed. You know, Kevin, these visits of yours mean more to me than you could ever know. You've brought life back into this old house. In that moment, Kevin saw Mr. Whitley in a new light. He wasn't simply a guy, the rich man who had provided him with a scholarship. He was a friend, a mentor, someone who had lived a full life and had so much wisdom to share. I'm glad I can be here for you, Mr. Whitley, Kevin said with sincerity. I enjoy our time together too. Mr. Whitley smiled and patted Kevin's head. You're a nice lad, Kevin. You remind me of my own grandson sometimes. I wish they could all be here, but having you around, well, it makes this old house seem like a home again. As the days progressed into weeks, Kevin found himself spending more and more time at Mr. Whitley's house, the once he was a resident of this old house. Kevin's hands, which had been soft from schooling, now wore calluses from digging in the ground and cutting unruly branches on a sunny day as they worked side by side in the garden. The garden had been neglected, but due to their joint efforts, it started to flourish with bright flowers and lush vegetation. The garden, Mr. Whitley paused to wipe his brow and said, You know, Kevin, with his voice filled with warmth, there's something special about watching things grow. It teaches you patience and care. Kevin nodded, feeling a sense of pride as he looked at the flourishing plants around them. I never thought I'd enjoy gardening, Mr. Whitley said. Mr. Whitley laughed and said, Life is funny in that way. Sometimes the things we least expect bring us the most joy. As they worked, Mr. Whitley shared memories from his history with Kevin. He told Kevin about his first job, which was as a paperboy, which was quite similar to Kevin's present role at the company. Newspaper firm. It taught me the importance of hard work and responsibility, Mr. Whitley added, much like what you're doing now. Kevin listened closely, taking up every word of wisdom, and he understood that through these simple activities, planting, he has learned the value of hard labor and responsibility. Mr. Whitley was learning a great deal more than he could ever learn from a textbook. He was planting seeds, watering flowers, and even doing errands for Mr. Whitley. One day, as they were finishing up their gardening, Mr. Whitley turned to Kevin with a smile in his eye and said, You know, my boy, there's a saying on the subject. The finest fertilizer is the gardener's shadow, which indicates that the most essential factor in fostering development is just being there and attention. Kevin pondered this for a time, thinking about how you are educating me just by allowing me to assist you. Mr. Whitley smiled kindly and said, Yes, you are teaching me. As Kevin walked home that evening, he felt a profound sense of satisfaction. The ache in his muscles from a day of hard work felt good, and he realized that helping Mr. Whitley had become more than just a way to show gratitude. It had become a source of happiness for him. Kevin, you are also reminding this elderly man of the joy that can be found in the simplest of things. Happiness and contentment. In and of itself, as the weeks went, Kevin started to notice tiny changes in Mr. Whitley's behavior. The previously reclusive elderly man appeared to stand a little straighter, his eyes brighter and more alert. Kevin couldn't help but feel a feeling of pride, knowing that their relationship had been successful. One bright and sunny Saturday morning, as Kevin arrived at Mr. Whitley's house for their regular gardening session, he discovered that the older man was dressed in a smart casual outfit, rather than his usual gardening clothes. Kevin, my boy, Mr. Whitley called out with a smile spreading across his face. It's time for us to spend some time together. When Kevin's interest was piqued, Mr. Whitley said, What did you have in mind? Mr. Whitley started to speak with a touch of excitement in his voice. He said, I heard there's a community fair happening in the park today. I thought we might go and see it. I hope you don't mind, but I thought we might do something new today. See what it's all about. Kevin's eyes widened in surprise. In all the time he'd known Mr. Whitley, the elder man had never exhibited interest in community activities. That sounds fantastic, Kevin said eagerly as they headed to the location of the event. park, Kevin couldn't help but notice how Mr. Whitley greeted neighbors along the way, exchanging pleasantries with people he had previously ignored at the fair. Mr. Whitley's eyes lit up at the various stalls and activities, and he even stopped to chat with the organizers, asking questions about the purpose of the event. Mr. Whitley said, "You know, Kevin, what I'm talking about." Kevin gave a little nod, feeling a warmth run through his chest, and said, "It's now never too late to be a part of it, mister. I've lived in this town for decades, but I feel like I'm seeing it for the first time. Because there is so much life here. There is a lot of community spirit." Whitley. In the weeks that followed, Kevin became aware of Mr. Whitley's growing involvement in community affairs. The senior citizen started going to meetings of the town council, where he shared his observations and experiences. He also made generous contributions to local charities and even volunteered at the community center. One day, while they were working in the garden, Mr. Whitley turned out to be a volunteer at the community center. Kevin said to himself with a gleam in his eye, "You know, my boy, I've been thinking that this town has given me so much over the years, that it's high time I gave something back." As the weeks turned into months, Kevin's relationship with Mr. Whitley continued to blossom, and their time together became more than just doing chores and errands. It blossomed into a deep, meaningful friendship that filled a hole in both their life. One clear autumn day, as they sat on Mr. Whitley's porch drinking hot chocolate, Kevin saw a faraway look in the elder man's eyes. "Is everything all right, Mr. Whitley?" he inquired, worry obvious in his voice. "Mr. Whitley." Kevin listened attentively as Mr. Whitley related anecdotes about his grandson Thomas, his eyes glimmering with joy and a touch of pride. "I smiled slightly just thinking about my grandson Thomas, who is approximately your age and lives in Europe with his parents." Sadness as he talked. Kevin noticed how much Mr. Whitley missed having family close. "You remind me of him sometimes," Mr. Whitley said, his voice tender with love. "Your generosity, your want to learn. It's like having a piece of my heart in your hands. Having family here with me." Kevin felt a lump develop in his throat. "I'm pleased I can be here for you, Mr. Whitley. You've become like a grandpa to me." Mr. Whitley's eyes glossed it over. "And you, my boy, have become the grandchild I seldom get to see. I'm thankful for that more than I am for seeing you." Kevin continued to share more about his own life, including his aspirations, worries, and ambitions for the future. Mr. Whitley listened attentively and offered words of wisdom and encouragement. In response, Mr. Whitley opened up to Kevin about his own life. From that day forward, their friendship became even stronger. Open up about his own history, he shared with Kevin his childhood during simpler times, his journey to success in business, and the joys and sorrows he'd experienced along the way. Kevin hung on every word, treasuring these glimpses into Mr. Whitley's life as they shared these personal stories and experiences while they were together. As the connection between them grew stronger, Kevin found himself looking forward to their time together, not only for the lessons he learned, but also for the companionship they shared. Mr. Whitley appeared to come to life during their conversations, his eyes shining with interest and affection. Kevin's routine settled into a comfortable rhythm as he balanced his life. Kevin never wavered in his dedication to any of these significant aspects of his life, including his responsibilities at school, his part-time job at the local newspaper company, and his regular visits to Mr. Whitley, despite the fact that he had a very busy schedule. Kevin worked at the newspaper company, and he continued to impress his co-workers with his dedication while juggling both school and work. As part of his part-time employment, he worked carefully to sort and bundle newspapers, making sure that they were ready for delivery each morning. His supervisor, Mrs. Thompson, often complimented Kevin on his dependability and attention to detail. Mrs. Thompson commented, "You are one of our best workers." After noon, she gave him a pat on the shoulder and said, "We are fortunate to have you here." Kevin beamed with pride at her words, feeling a sense of accomplishment in his work. He knew that every dollar he earned was a step closer to his goals, and he took pride in contributing to his family's finances after his shifts at the newspaper company. Kevin would frequently visit his family after his shifts. Made his way to Mr. Whitley's home, he would knock on the door. His bag would still be slung over his shoulder, and he would be eager to spend time with his old buddy. Mr. Whitley would always welcome him with a warm grin, and he would ask Kevin how his job was going today. He was truly interested in the boy's day. Mr. Whitley listened attentively, offering words of encouragement, and occasionally sharing his own experiences from his working days as they spent time together. Kevin would share stories from his job, recounting funny incidents with misplaced newspapers or describing the satisfaction of seeing the neatly stacked bundles ready for delivery. Mr. Whitley would also occasionally share his previous experiences from his working days. Together, Kevin assisted Mr. Whitley with a variety of tasks around the house. Sometimes they would work in the garden, planting flowers or trimming bushes. Other times, they would tackle small repair projects inside the house. Throughout it all, Kevin absorbed Mr. Whitley's wisdom and important life lessons. Despite the additional time he spent with Mr. Whitley, Kevin never allowed himself to become overly dependent on Mr. Whitley. Kevin's grades remained excellent, and his professors continued to commend his hard work and devotion as the weeks grew into months. He made sure to finish his assignments methodically, often studying at Mr. Whitley's dining room table, while the older man read nearby. Kevin's other obligations were neglected. Kevin's visits to Mr. Whitley's house became more than just a routine. They became a highlight of his week. The young boy found himself looking forward to these moments, eagerly anticipating the stories and wisdom that Mr. Whitley would share with him on a sunny afternoon as they sat on the porch sipping lemonade. Kevin's friendship with Mr. Whitley began to develop over the course of several months. Realized how much these visits meant to him, Mr. Whitley was narrating a tale about his younger days, his eyes glittering with mischief and nostalgia. Kevin listened closely, hanging on every word. "You know, Kevin," Mr. Whitley said, his voice was warm and soft. "I'm so glad you found my wallet." Kevin recognized the significance of these visits. That day, "It has given me so much more than just my money back to me." Kevin felt a knot develop in his throat. He nodded, and for a minute he was unable to speak. When he finally found his voice, he said, "I'm glad too, Mr. Whitley. I never thought that returning a wallet could lead to you." This Mr. Whitley reached out and patted Kevin's hand. "This friendship that we've built is worth more than any amount of money in that wallet or any scholarship fund." Kevin's eyes widened at the mention of the scholarship because he had almost forgotten about it, because he was so engrossed in the pleasure of spending time with Mr. Whitley. As soon as Whitley got the epiphany, he realized that the scholarship, albeit being very kind and significant for his future, was not the most valuable thing he had received from this connection. Kevin remarked in a gentle voice, "You are absolutely right. I have gained a great deal of knowledge from you, Mr. Whitley, about life, about compassion, about what truly counts, that is worth more than any scholarship." Mr. Whitley's eyes skipped it over, and he grasped Kevin's hand. "You've taught me a thing or two as well, young man. You've reminded this old codger what it's like to have hope and to have faith in the future." Kevin had a profound feeling of happiness sweep over him as they sat there enjoying a comfortable quiet and watched the sun begin to drop. He understood that in Mr. Whitley, he had discovered not just a benefactor but also a genuine friend and mentor, and the lessons he was learning were being taught to him so that he might view the world through new eyes. Stories he was hearing, the connection he was forming, these were the real treasures. As summer came to a close, Kevin found himself facing a new chapter in his life. The prestigious Oakwood High School had accepted him thanks in large part to Mr. Whitley's scholarship. The news had arrived in a thick envelope, and he was overwhelmed with emotion. Kevin's hands shook as he opened it. "I got in," he mumbled, his eyes wide with surprise. Mrs. Johnson grabbed her son firmly, floods of pleasure flowing down her face. "Oh, Kevin, I'm so proud of you," Kevin wanted to say. Kevin's first inclination was to share the news with Mr. Whitley. He hurried over to the house of the elderly man, his heart pounding with excitement. When Mr. Whitley opened the door, Kevin couldn't contain himself. "Mr. Whitley, I got accepted to Oakwood High School," he exclaimed, waving the acceptance letter. Mr. Whitley's face lit up with excitement, up with a kind grin. "Well, Now that's fantastic news. My boy, come in, we must sell Kate. While they sat in Mr. Whitley's office, Kevin's initial delight began to give way to a knowing uneasiness. The reality of entering such a prestigious institution started to seep in. He fidgeted with the phone. Kate was a member of the group, letter his brow furrowing. What's worrying you? Kevin, Mr. Whitley asked, noticing the change in the boy's manner. Kevin paused before speaking. It's just, Oakwood is such a fancy school. What if I don't fit in? What if I don't fit in? What if I don't fit in what? Mr. Whitley moved forward, his eyes gentle but strong, and said, Listen here, Kevin. You've earned your place at that school. Your hard work and dedication got you there. It's not just my scholarship. Kevin nodded, but the anxiety was clear. He was concerned about his future. Kevin, you are a brilliant, hard-working young man with a decent heart, and those traits will serve you well no matter where you go. Mr. Whitley continued, his voice calm but full with conviction. I have every confidence in your capacity to succeed, he said. I have every confidence in your ability to succeed. With a quiet voice, Kevin requested for assistance. Mr. Whitley reached out and stroked Kevin's hand. I'll be here for you every step of the way, he said. My support doesn't end with the scholarship. You can always come to me for anything. Kevin felt a flood of relief wash over him. He was not alone on this new journey. He had his mother, and he had Mr. Whitley with him. With their support, he felt ready to face any problems Oakwood High would offer. As the first day of school at Oakwood High approached, Kevin felt a sense of anticipation. With a mixture of pleasure and apprehension, he stood in front of the mirror, adjusting his new uniform, which felt stiff and strange. Mrs. Johnson assisted him with his tie, and her eyes sparkled with pride as she exclaimed, You look so grown up, Kevin. Kevin's voice wavered slightly as she spoke. The moment Kevin stepped into Oakwood High School, he felt overwhelmed. The hallways were bustling with students who seemed to exude confidence and sophistication. Kevin clutched his backpack tightly, feeling out of place in this grand building with its polished exterior. He gave her a nervous smile and said, Thank you, Mom. I hope I'm ready for this. Floors and elegant architecture in his first session. Advanced literature. Kevin found himself surrounded by peers who talked eloquently about novels he had never even heard of. Kevin slid lower in his seat, feeling more and more out of his element with each passing minute as the days went by. Kevin passed through his first class. The workload was significantly more intense than anything he had ever experienced before, and he frequently found himself staying up late into the night. He struggled to keep up with the rigorous coursework, and he spent hours each night poring over textbooks in an attempt to comprehend concepts that appeared to come easily to his classmates. During his lunch breaks, Kevin sat by himself to accomplish his homework. As he saw other students congregate in groups to discuss their weekend plans at country clubs or their future travels to exotic destinations, he couldn't help but feel like an outsider who was highly aware of the stark environment. Differences between his background and that of his classmates. Despite these challenges, Kevin refused to give up. He remembered Mr. Whitley's words of encouragement and drew strength from them. Kevin began to spend extra time in the library, seeking help from teachers during their office hours and pushing himself to improve. One evening, as Kevin sat at his desk, I am not going to give up, Kevin said. The door to his desk, which was surrounded by stacks of books and papers, was softly tapped on by Mrs. Johnson. Kevin, honey, it's getting late. You should get some rest, she murmured with worry in her voice. Kevin glanced up, his eyes sleepy, but he continued to watch the television. Mrs. Johnson sat down next to him and placed a reassuring hand on his shoulder. I am so proud of how hard you are working, Kevin, but remember that you earned it, she said. I am determined that I cannot, Mom. I need to finish this essay and study for tomorrow's math test. Your place at this school? Don't doubt yourself. Her words gave Kevin a renewed sense of purpose. Kevin nodded, grateful for her support, and said, Thank you, Mom. I won't give up. I'll make you and Mr. Whitley proud. Kevin turned back with renewed determination. As the weekends rolled around, Kevin found himself eagerly anticipating his visits to Mr. Whitley's house. The grand estate, which had once seemed intimidating, now felt like a sanctuary, a place where Kevin could escape the pressures of his studies. In addition to his studies, Kevin was prepared to face whatever challenges lay ahead at Oakwood High. Kevin, who was just starting off at his new school, made his way up the winding walk to Mr. Whitley's front door on a crisp Saturday morning. The elderly man welcomed him with a warm grin, his eyes glittering with real compassion. "My boy, come in," Mr. Whitley murmured as he ushered him in. Kevin started to describe his troubles at Oakwood High, his voice colored with aggravation and self-doubt. Mr. Whitley listened closely and nodded his head in understanding as Kevin shared his experiences. Kevin felt the weight of the previous week lifting from his shoulders as they relaxed into the cozy study. Concluded, the elderly man moved forward in his chair, his eyes steady and encouraging Kevin. He continued, his voice calm but forceful. "Remember that while you are attending that school, it is not to become like everyone else, but rather to study and develop while being true to who you are." They began their chat by saying, "Don't lose sight of that, no matter how difficult things get." Kevin nodded, soaking in Mr. Whitley's remarks. "The values that got you here are your honesty, your work ethic, and your kindness." Mr. Whitley said, "Don't lose sight of that, no matter how challenging things get." Felt a sense of calm washing over him. Mr. Whitley shared stories from his own youth times when he had faced adversity and how he had overcome it by staying true to his principles. These weekend visits became Kevin's anchor, grounding him amidst the turbulent seas of his new academic life. In Mr. Whitley's presence, Kevin felt a sense of calm wash over him. As the weeks went by, Kevin began to find his rhythm at Oakwood High. His early troubles gave way to tiny successes, and he started to feel more at home in the crowded corridors and throughout the campus. Not only did he find comfort, but he also discovered the knowledge and advice he needed to overcome his obstacles. Difficult classrooms. There was a day when Kevin observed a new student eating alone during lunch. Without any hesitation, he approached the lad and introduced himself, saying, "Hello, my name is Kevin. Would you mind if I joined you?" The new student, whose name was Alex, smiled gratefully and said, "Thank you. I'd like that, Kevin's." Kevin's teacher assigned a group project, which surprised him because several of his classmates asked him to participate in it. Soon after, other classmates began to see Kevin in a new light. They admired his friendly demeanor and willingness to help others, even though he was working hard to keep up with his studies in his English class. Kevin's teacher had assigned a group project. Kevin responded to Sarah saying, "You are one of the best students in the class and you always have such interesting ideas." Kevin felt a warmth run through his chest, and he realized that he was finally starting to belong. As Kevin's confidence increased at school, his friendship with Sarah got stronger. The relationship between Mr. Whitley and Kevin continued to develop over the course of their weekend visits. Kevin excitedly shared his experiences and minor victories with Mr. Whitley. "I am so proud of you, my boy," Mr. Whitley exclaimed one day, his eyes filling with delight. "You are demonstrating that kindness and hard work truly do pay off." Kevin glowed with pride at the compliments, saying, "I couldn't have done it without your guidance, Mr. Whitley. You've taught me so much." Mr. Whitley laughed as he patted Kevin's hand and said, "You had it in you all along, Kevin. I just helped you see it." As they sat together, exchanging tales and laughs, Kevin realized how far he'd come. Kevin was becoming the person he had always desired to be as the seasons changed. Mr. Whitley's age started to show more visibly. His feet got a bit slower, and his posture grew more relaxed. Kevin was no longer the frightened child who had first walked into Oakwood High School. With Mr. Whitley's knowledge and his own dedication, Kevin was becoming the person he had always longed to be. Kevin, who was now more sensitive to Mr. Whitley's requirements, took it upon himself to assist Mr. Whitley more around the home. He began mowing the grass, and his hands shook slightly when he poured his morning tea. However, despite these minor indications of age, Mr. Whitley continued to be astonishingly energetic and enthusiastic. Kevin would come early on Saturdays, equipped with gardening gloves and a determined grin. "Mr. Whitley, I thought we might plant some new flowers in the front garden today." Kevin proposed that we do it on a sunny morning. Kevin would make sure that the big estate kept its majestic beauty every weekend. "Do you have any thoughts about some brilliant yellow daffodils?" Mr. Whitley's eyes brightened up at the notion. "That sounds beautiful." My darling wife's favorite color was yellow, and while they worked side by side in the garden, Kevin listened closely to Mr. Whitley's anecdotes about his life before his wife passed away. Kevin also took on the task of organizing Mr. Whitley's vast library. As he carefully dusted each book, Mr. Whitley would share anecdotes about his favorite authors and the places he traveled. And you know, Mr. Whitley said that Kevin was the one who took on the task. The elderly man's voice was filled with warmth and love as he recounted their adventures together. "One day, as they sat in the study, I never imagined I'd enjoy company this much again. You've brought a spark back into my life." Kevin felt a lump grow in his throat. "Rich, you've done the same for me, Mr. Whitley. I've learnt so much from you." Their friendship strengthened with each passing. They would sit by the fireplace on rainy days and share tales and dreams. Mr. Whitley would teach Kevin how to prepare some of his favorite meals in the kitchen once a day. During the day, they would spend hours playing chess with Mr. Whitley, who would painstakingly teach Kevin the finer elements of strategy. Mr. Whitley laughed as Kevin proudly delivered a flawlessly cooked apple pie. Kevin glowed with delight and said, "I had a perfect apple pie." The area that had been a lonely place for the elderly man suddenly resounded with laughter and the clatter of pots and pans. Great teacher. As their friendship flourished, Kevin realized that the time he spent with Mr. Whitley had become the highlight of his week. The wisdom and kindness of the old man had become an integral part of his life, guiding him through the challenges of school and adolescence. As spring arrived, Mr. Whitley and Kevin were able to make the most of their time together. He added gently, "I'm afraid I've let it go these days," as he stood at the edge of the once lovely garden that had become overgrown and neglected. Mr. Whitley sighed and looked at Misty with recollections. "You know, Kevin, this garden used to be my wife's pride and joy," he said. Over the course of the last several years, Kevin glanced up at Mr. Whitley and saw the grief in his eyes. He proposed, with his voice filled with passion, that we should make it beautiful again. Mr. Whitley's face brightened up at the suggestion. "Idea, that is a fantastic notion, my son. It would be good to see it blossom once again." And so their new project began every weekend. Kevin would come early, eager to attack the garden they started by cleaning out the weeds and overgrown shrubs, their hands working diligently in preparation for the new endeavor. Kevin was educated by Mr. Whitley about various plants and flowers, and he shared anecdotes about each one while they worked on these roses here. He would add that my wife's favorite roses were those that were pruned meticulously, and she would tend to them every day. Kevin listened eagerly, taking up the information. Every word and every lesson he learned about the importance of patience as they waited for seeds to sprout and bulbs to bloom. Mr. Whitley showed him how to care for delicate flowers and nurture plants that were resistant to being cultivated. As the weeks passed, the garden gradually began to transform, and colorful flowers began to peek through the soil. The bushes that had been wild began to take shape. On neatly carved outlines, Kevin felt a feeling of pride every time he saw a new bud or a flower that had just sprouted. "It is incredible how much labor goes into a garden," Kevin observed one day while wiping perspiration from his forehead. Mr. discreetly nodded and smiled gently on his face. His face, sure, but that is what makes it so fulfilling. You put in the effort, and nature rewards you with beauty. Their time spent in the garden became more than just labor. It was an opportunity for them to communicate, exchange memories, and to bond with one another. As the two of them became closer, Kevin found himself opening up to Mr. Whitley about his troubles at school and his goals for the future. Mr. Whitley, in turn, imparted knowledge from his long life, providing direction and support on the garden as spring evolved into summer. As the flowers blossomed into full bloom, roses climbed up trellises, daisies danced in the air, and butterflies hovered among the petals. Mr. Whitley and Kevin stepped back one day to admire their workmanship. "We did it," Kevin remarked with wonder in his voice. "It's beautiful." As the garden blossomed under their care, so did the link between Kevin and Mr. Whitley, which had been neglected in the past. Whitley placed his hand on Kevin's shoulder, and his eyes shone with pride and love. "Yes, we did it, my baby. And it's all the more beautiful because we did it together." Kevin found himself looking forward to their weekend gardening sessions more and more, not just for the satisfaction of tending to the plants, but for the companionship of Mr. Whitley on a sunny Saturday, as they sat on the porch, enjoying lemonade after a morning of working. This was a reflection of the growth of their relationship, which had become a vibrant oasis. Mr. Whitley turned to Kevin with a kind grin and said, "You know, my boy, I never thought I'd enjoy gardening again, but with you here, it's become the highlight of my week." Kevin felt a warmth run through his chest. "And I too, Mr. Whitley. Love learning from you and hearing your thoughts." Stories as the weeks went by, their conversations became more in-depth. Kevin shared his hopes and fears about school, and Mr. Whitley listened with the patience and understanding of a loving grandfather. Mr. Whitley then opened up about his own life, sharing the wisdom he had gained from years of experience when Kevin aced a piece of homework. Mr. Whitley was the first person he wanted to tell after his mother about the extremely tough exam. He ran to the old man's home, overflowing with enthusiasm, and told Mr. Whitley, "I did it. I got an A on my chemistry test." Kevin screamed, his face shining with pride, and Mr. Whitley's eyes brightened up. "Up with joy, that's wonderful, Kevin. I knew you could do it. You've been working so hard." He pulled Kevin into a warm hug, surprising them both with the gesture as they pulled apart. Kevin felt tears prickling at the corners of his eyes. It wasn't just the pride in his academic achievement. It was the realization that all of his hard work had paid off. He had found a family, and Mr. Whitley appeared to understand Kevin's emotions. He stated to Kevin in a gentle voice, "I may not have grandchildren nearby, but you've become like a grandson to me. I'm so proud of you, not just for your accomplishments, but for everything you've accomplished in your life. Grades, but for the wonderful young man you are getting to be." Kevin swallowed hard and was moved by Mr. Whitley's comments. "Thank you, Mr. Whitley. You are like family to me as well." From that day on, their bond became even deeper, and they celebrated one another. When Mr. Whitley perfected a new dish, Kevin was there to taste, test, and cheer. When Kevin won a writing contest at school, Mr. Whitley insisted on framing the tale and hanging it in his study. As the weeks went, Mrs. Johnson couldn't help but feel proud of Kevin's accomplishments, no matter how large or how tiny. One evening, as Kevin joyfully recounted his most recent meeting with Mr. Whitley over dinner, Mrs. Whitley became aware of the good changes that had occurred in Kevin. Her son seemed to be more self-assured, more focused, and happier than he had ever been before. She was under the impression that Mr. Whitley's influence had played a key part in this transformation. A decision was made by Johnson, who smiled warmly at her son and asked, "Why don't we invite Mr. Whitley over for dinner next week?" Kevin's eyes lit up with excitement, and she responded, "Really, Mom, that would be amazing." On the following Saturday, Mr. Whitley arrived at the Johnsons' humble home with a bouquet of flowers that he had grown in his garden. A warm greeting was extended to him by Mrs. Johnson, who was moved by the considerate gesture. As everyone sat down to eat, the atmosphere was filled with warmth and laughter. Mr. Whitley entertained them with memories from his youth, and Kevin recalled his most recent school experience. After dinner, Mrs. Johnson said to Mr. Whitley, "We'd love to have you join us for dinner more often. You're always welcome in our home." Mr. Whitley's eyes misted over with excitement as Mrs. Johnson watched the two interact with each other. Mrs. Johnson was filled with joy as she witnessed the genuine affection that existed between them. Emotion. I don't know what to say. Thank you, Miss Johnson. It means more to me than you know." Because from that day on, Mr. Whitley became a frequent feature at the Johnson family meals, which began as a weekly affair and eventually reached twice a week on occasion. As the months went by, Mr. Whitley's demeanor changed noticeably. His stern exterior melted away, and it was replaced by a gentle, grandfatherly presence. He began to open up more, sharing stories of his late wife and his own childhood. He was surrounded by warmth and love that he hadn't experienced in years. He found himself surrounded by these feelings 3 times a week. With Kevin and Mrs. Johnson, the relationship between Kevin and Mr. Whitley continued to blossom as the seasons changed. Their connection became stronger with each passing day, and it eventually became an essential component of both of their lives. On a bright and sunny Saturday morning, I arrived to Mr. Whitley's home, anxious to begin their day together. Mr. Whitley yelled out enthusiastically, "Are you ready for the community fair?" Mr. Whitley came from his house with a bright grin on his face, and he said, "Yes, I am, my boy. Let's go spread some happiness, shall we?" Kevin and Mr. Whitley walked side by side, taking in the sights and sounds as they made their way to the local park where the fair was being held. The air was filled with the aroma of cotton candy and the sound of laughter. They stopped at a booth where volunteers were needed to assist in running games, even though there were no volunteers available. After some reluctance, both Kevin and Mr. Whitley rolled up their sleeves and started to work. Kevin was in charge of the ring toss, while Mr. Whitley was in charge of handing out prizes to the children, who were very happy. While they were working, Kevin couldn't help but notice the joy that was on Mr. Whitley's face. Mr. Whitley had been a recluse in the past. After the fair, they went to Kevin's home for dinner, where Mrs. Johnson received them with a warm greeting, and the scent of her renowned pot filled the air. She asked them how the fair was for them both as they sat down. His eyes sparkled with glee as he spoke readily with strangers. "To eat, it was lovely, Mrs. Johnson." Mr. Whitley responded with a voice full of passion, "I can't remember the last time I had so much fun." Kevin nodded in agreement, saying, "We should volunteer more often, Mr. Whitley. It felt really good to help." During the course of their breakfast, Mr. Whitley entertained them with tales from his boyhood, and Kevin filled them in on his plans for the forthcoming academic year. Laughter and discussion were flowing easily between them. The occurrence of moments of togetherness had become into a frequent occurrence, which brought Kevin and Mr. Whitley an amazing amount of delight in their lives. In addition to a sense of accomplishment, their relationship had developed into something genuinely unique, a connection that was not limited by age. When Kevin was standing in front of the mirror to fix his graduation hat, he couldn't help but be amazed at how much he had accomplished. Since that fateful day, when he discovered Mr. Whitley's wallet, his life had undergone a transformation. The years had flown by, and they were filled with moments of progress. He reflected on his first day at the gym, which was filled with both delight and challenges. Now that he was set to graduate from a famous high school, he was feeling out of place and overwhelmed there. Kevin grinned as he recalled how Mr. Whitley had always inspired him throughout the whole process of graduating with honors. "As for you, Kevin, are you prepared?" Mrs. Johnson phoned from the basement, and Mr. Whitley will be there. Take a big breath and go downstairs. As soon as he reaches the lowest step, Kevin took a deep breath and headed downstairs. There was a tap at the door, and Mrs. Johnson answered it to see Mr. Whitley standing there looking dapper in his suit and carrying a... "There's our graduate, Mr. Whitley, in the small gift box," he cried, his eyes dancing with excitement. "It's hard for me to comprehend that today has already arrived." He drew Kevin into a loving hug with pride. Kevin now felt a knot rise in his throat, and he thought to himself, "I couldn't have done it." "In the absence of you, Mr. Whitley," he said as they drove to the wedding, Kevin's thoughts were on you. Traveled back in time to all of the times he had spent with Mr. Whitley throughout the years, including the garden that they had worked together to restore. Both the lengthy conversations that took place on the porch and the family meals had played a significant role in Kevin's development into the guy he is today. Kevin felt a sensation of readiness sweep over him as he waited in the auditorium for his name to be called. He was aware that he was about to be called. Thanks to Mr. Whitley's direction, he was equipped to deal with any difficulties that could arise in the future. Kevin looked across to his partner, who had provided him with the unflinching support that had enabled him to pursue his aspirations of being a successful businessman. The proud Mr. Whitley, who was sitting next to Mrs. Johnson, was smiling with joy as he looked at them. Eyes met, and at that same instant, Kevin had an overwhelming sense of thankfulness for the profound family. During the time when Kevin's name was being called, he went across the stage with the bond that they had built. As he held his head high and exuded self-assurance, the audience erupted in shouts, but without any, were more audible than those coming from Mr. Whitley and Mrs. Johnson, and their expressions of pride were visible when Kevin accepted his assignment. Graduation. The pinnacle of years of hard work and devotion after the ceremony in the middle of the chaos and confusion. Kevin felt himself attracted to Mr. Whitley, and he was surrounded by a sea of congratulations and embraces. "Let's go to the garden, mister." As they made their approach to Mr. Whitley's house, Whitley made a hushed suggestion with a subtle smile in his eye. Place of residence where the garden, which had been neglected in the past, suddenly bloomed with vivid hues and lovely smells. As they sat there, the metamorphosis of the garden was a reflection of the development of their relationship over the course of the years. As Mr. Whitley was sitting on the bench that they had arranged together many years before, he turned to Kevin his. "Kevin, my kid," he started his voice as his eyes began to glaze over him. "I want you to know how extremely proud I am of you, and I just want you to know that feeling." "Thank you very much, Mr. Whitley." Kevin grinned as he felt a lump rise in his throat. "Congratulations." Mr. Whitley softly shook his head and said, "It's not impossible. I couldn't have done it without you. Despite the fact that your academic accomplishments are obviously excellent, the thing that really makes me proud is the sort of service you have provided. You have developed into a smart young man," he said, pointing to the garden that was all about them, "like these flowers that you have bloomed. Kevin, you have shown compassion even in the face of adversity, and you have exhibited grace and persistence to others, even when it would have been difficult, and you have brought a great deal of happiness into my life." As Mr. Whitley proceeded, Kevin's eyes began to fill up with tears. According to Mr. Whitley, "When you discovered my wallet on that particular day, you didn't merely. You gave me something that is far more important than money, a friendship that has enhanced my life beyond measure. Refund my money." Kevin felt a flood of emotion rush over him as he listened to Mr. Whitley's thoughtful comments. He took a long breath and reflected on what he had just heard. After taking a deep breath and attempting to settle his voice before starting, Mr. Whitley Kevin started his eyes. "I am filled with gratitude, and I cannot express how much I appreciate all you have done for me, including your support and your affection and wisdom have meant more to me than I am able to convey." Kevin stopped and looked around at the people surrounding him. If it weren't for the lovely garden that they had cultivated together, I wouldn't be where I am right now. Without you, you have taught me a great deal, not just about gardening or academics, but also about other things. With regard to life, with regard to being nice, and with regard to what it is to be a decent person, Mr. Whitley. He smiled and placed a soothing hand on Kevin's shoulder. "Would you like to go for a walk with me?" he said. And when they were strolling around the garden, suggested pointing to the meandering route that went through the garden. As we continued to stand side by side, Kevin said, "I want you to know that no matter where life takes me, our connection will always remain strong. You are not just my guide, Mr. Whitley. You are also a member of my family." Mr. Whitley bowed his head. "You, my darling, are the grandson I never had, and you are sparkling with tears that have not yet been cried. I am so." They strolled in a relaxed manner, expressing their gratitude for the wallet that you discovered all those years ago. Momentarily, taking in the splendor of the flowers that were all about them, the garden once in a time. A living tribute to their relationship and the things they shared. Plants that had been neglected and dead suddenly flourished with brilliant colors and pleasant fragrances. You are aware that Kevin mentioned in a low voice that this garden brings to recall our connection. began with a relatively little item, such as a wallet that was misplaced or a neglected area of land, and let's have a look at what we've accomplished together, Mr. Whitley said with a smile, his face beaming with happiness. Kevin, do you agree? Regardless of the time of year, our relationship will continue to blossom in this garden. You would still return a wallet if you were in a difficult circumstance like Kevin. Would you say that you would? Please let me know in the comments section below. I would be very interested in hearing your point of view. And if you liked the video, please let me know. Please subscribe to my channel, as I am now devoting countless hours to the creation of these uplifting tales for you and your companions. I am able to sustain myself with help. I am grateful to you.